I wanted to start maybe with Tara's point about sort of the durability of this kind of, I'll conflate your 2 points and say the durability of imminent individualist religion in American life, right? And the fact that you have plenty of, divination and God within spirituality going back to the 18th century. It seems to me that if you look at sort of the historical pattern in American life, you have sort of either surges of that kind of spirituality or particular religious geniuses who manifest it. And then the movements and institutions that they build have historically then been sort of pulled back towards a kind of normative Christian structure or framework, to use Steve's account, right? So, to take the examples of the 2 biggest 19th century examples maybe are Christian Science, which comes out of New Thought in certain ways, and Mormonism, which gets its start in the sort of the kind of divination happy world of upstate New York in the early 19th century. And both of those, if you look at them from a sort of, how Christian are they perspective at the outset, you can make a case that they're both pretty stark departures, maybe not getting all the way to something we call paganism or post-Christianity, but clearly really stark departures. In Mormonism's case, you mentioned polyamory, right, as a feature of the contemporary political landscape. Early Mormonism goes all the way to polygamy. And then, over the course of the next 100 years, you get to a point where by the time of the 1950s and 1960s, both Christian Science and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, while they're still regarded as heretical or dangerous or cultic by some other Christian denominations, are, I think, reasonably seen as connected to a kind of, a kind of Christian tradition in American life. And there's clearly an aspiration, at least among parts of the leadership of those what become those churches, to move in that direction. And it seems to me one thing that's been different since the 60s and 70s, right, is that hasn't happened to the same degree, right? So we've gone through the sort of Marianne Williamson presidential campaign, which unfortunately has not won enough support to merit the fascination that I've applied to it. But I feel like a 19th century version of Marianne Williamson would have started a church, right? And would have, and over the course of 50 years, there would be a sort of Williamsonian denomination that had some sort of ambiguous relationship to the Protestant center in American life. And, Williamson has some kind of institution now, but it's very clear that she doesn't regard herself as in that light. And the same goes for, figures ranging from Deepak Chopra to Oprah Winfrey and so on. And so I'm curious what you think, spending time in these religious worlds, what happens when that doesn't happen, right? Like, what happens to this kind of spiritual energy if there isn't, one, institution building, or two, a sort of pull back towards a kind of, quasi-normative Christian framework? Does it just continue? Are we in just a sort of endless cycle, right, where astrology was big when my parents were young, and when I was growing up, I knew what my parents' sign was, and then by the time I got to college in the 1990s, nobody talked about astrology anymore, but now it's back. Like, do we just run a cycle, or what do you think happens?
So I think I would motion that, you mentioned Oprah, and I can think of Gwyneth Paltrow, that the lifestyle brand may have perhaps in some senses replaced the church as the kind of institutionalization of a certain kind of spiritual trend, which is to say, sure, Oprah doesn't have a church exactly, but at the same time, there is a degree in which sort of with enough money, with enough of a following, the sort of grassroots fringe traditions do become, like astrology, like psychics, which are now at, Goop summits, do become codified in some way.